But John and Yoko felt that they could use their popularity to not talk politics, but to talk peace and love. And I thought that was a very powerful message. And I was very happy to help them promote that message. And I must say, to be a messenger of John and Yoko's ideas is one of the joys of my life.
You're listening to Staring at the World with BoDeans, Kurt Newman, a T. Torrance Productions original podcast.
Hey everybody, it's Kurt Newman. This is the Staring at the World podcast. Today we have part 2 of the Bob Gruen interview. If you watched part 1, you know he's got a lot to talk about, everything from his childhood up to working with Ike and Tina, John and Yoko, the punk scene, the famous New York City picture of John Lennon. Real interesting stuff. I could have talked to him forever. So this is part 2. Hope you love it.
And at that point, they told me to come around more often and to take pictures whenever I wanted, and that they would give me total access.
Yeah.
And
that's amazing.
And that's worked out. I'm still friends with Yoko today.
Yeah, and you kind of developed a good friendship with them along the way while you're doing all this, right? I mean, at least that's the way it looks.
Sometimes it just work out. You know, I can't tell you how to become friends with somebody.
No,
even I have become friends with a lot of people. I guess I'm just a likable kind of person. But it's not something that you can try to become friends with somebody. They either like you or don't. I mean, on the other hand, I try not to be obnoxious. I try to be helpful.
Yeah, and you were saying you have that go with the flow kind of attitude, and I think that probably your personality lent to someone they felt they could trust to have around them.
True, and I'm not jealous of people. I never really want what they have. I just want what I, should get. And so that's a big part of it, because especially with somebody like John and Yoko, people are always wanting something.
Right.
And I was one of the people who's actually producing and giving them something.
Yeah. And so, I heard you say, though, you were, as part of what they were talking about, they had a big push about peace and love, and rock and roll in their message. And I heard you say that you kind of felt connected to that as well when you were around them and pushing that message.
Very much so. I mean, growing up, I was, I grew up shortly after the Second World War, and everybody was talking about peace and, eternal peace. And actually, the United Nations was formed. Their first day was the day after I was born. So I was basically born into a world that was supposed to be peaceful. And all my, early childhood, they had talked about it. And the first concert, per se, where I went into an auditorium to watch somebody sing, was Pete Seeger.
Yeah. And
his whole focus was about peace and love and equality, fairness for workers, fairness for all people. And he had people singing along, and it was kind of thing where you sing in 3-part harmony and the audience is all involved. And it was one of the most fun, most enjoyable, and yet it was the strongest message of any concert I've ever been to. And it became my favorite kind of music with a message, music that was saying something. Not just, I'm in love with this girl and I wish I could be with her.
Yeah.
More like, the times they were changing. Bob Dylan's kind of lyrics meant a lot to me when I was growing up. Songs with meaning for a better world. And so the Beatles were great. We all love the Beatles. We listened to them a lot. At least half of their songs talk about love. All you need is love. Love is all you need. They say that over and over and over again in many different ways. And when John and Yoko got together, because the Beatles kind of had a pact, Brian Epstein didn't want to get involved in politics. He wanted to have a commercial band that was a rock band. He didn't feel necessarily that musicians should make political statements. I still kind of feel that way for a lot of musicians. But John and Yoko felt that they could use their popularity to not talk politics, but to talk peace and love. and I thought that was a very powerful message, and I was very happy to help them promote that message. And I must say, to be a messenger of John and Yoko's ideas is one of the joys of my life. One of the real rewards of my life is that I get to help carry that message to more and more people.
Yeah. Can you talk to a little bit about, it's the same kind of thing. Growing up, I heard stories and stuff about, the angst in the Beatles and the breakup, and a lot of people blamed Yoko and stuff for getting involved and stuff like that. And I never felt like that was the real story. I just felt like John had felt like he had had his time with the Beatles. It was great, but he was kind of moving into a new era, and Yoko was part of that. What was your feeling about everything that happened from where you were standing kind of on the inside?
Well, I wasn't on the inside when the Beatles were breaking up.
No, but what you knew of John and Yoko.
They actually left England because the press was so mean to Yoko constantly. There was a lot of racism involved. It was shortly after the war when they had been taught to hate Japanese people and kill them.
Right.
That's pretty strong hatred to overcome. And the fact that, most rock stars and the other Beatles all ended up with a beautiful blonde model that was their girlfriend. John had this short Japanese woman who made weird art. Yoko was actually a star in the avant-garde art scene. John met her at her own one-woman exhibition.
Right.
In those days, and even in sometimes nowadays, it's hard for a woman artist to get a show, much less her own one-woman show.
Sure.
So Yoko was pretty advanced in the avant-garde world, but that's not the pop world. And so when you have the kind of artworks that Yoko has, which are more intellectual and require some thinking, and often bring up difficult feelings. A lot of Yoko's art deals with the pain that people have inside.
Yeah.
And when they would see her art and they would feel that pain, they would get very angry because they don't like feeling that pain.
Right.
And they would blame Yoko for making them feel that way. Rather than realizing how good she was to create something so powerful, they would be very angry that she created something so powerful.
Yeah.
And so blaming her for breaking up the Beatles was easy because the Beatles were breaking up.
Right.
If you read, there's a lot of history stories now about the Beatles. I think if you read into the actual history, I think it was George who kind of dropped out from the recording sessions because it wasn't the kind of music. He was going off more into the sitar and esoteric Indian kind of music. Paul was going off his own direction. And the fact that John and Yoko, had their direction was not different from the other three. It was a fourth direction. Each one of them was going on their own.
Right.
So the Beatles broke up because it was time, for them to end. One time when John came out of Dakota and some guys yelled at him and said, "Hey, John, when are you going to get back with the Beatles?" And John yelled back at them, "When are you going back to high school?"
Yeah.
So the Beatles was something he had done. He was very proud of. He learned a lot, but he was moving on. They were all moving on. And they all did great. I mean, each one of them has massive solo
they sure did.
career.
Jesus.
Not every band, the whole band ends up with their own great solo careers.
Right. Yeah. No, it was an incredible time, incredible music.
But I was always fascinated with Yoko, and it's kind of interesting in my life that I'm one of the few people who heard about Yoko before I heard about the Beatles. I happened to be reading an art magazine called The Realist, which was sort of a humor, satire art magazine. And they had an article about a Japanese woman who had a loft on Canal Street, and you paid $5 to go into the loft. And in the loft, there was large black bags, big enough that a person or two people could get into the bag. And you could get in the bag by yourself or with somebody. And in the bag, you could do your thing. So be a question, do whatever you wanted. Or you could just stand in the room and watch the bags move around and wonder what people were doing in them. And I just thought that was the weirdest thing I ever heard of. That was called art. And then a few years later, around 68 or so, when John and Yoko were together, there was John and Yoko inside of black bags. And I thought, well, there's not two Japanese ladies doing that kind of trick.
Yeah.
So I was intrigued, and they did some really funny things all for peace. They they sent an acorn to every leader of the world to plant in their country so the world would grow together in peace.
Yeah.
And of course, an oak tree spread around the world doesn't really mean much, but the concept of everybody growing together as peace was what they wanted to do. And when they had their wedding, they actually were looking for a place to have a honeymoon. Like most people, you want to go away and be private for a couple of days and just be together alone. But the more they thought about where they could go alone, John being the most famous person in the world, they realized that the more secret they were, the more valuable a picture of them would be, and the more intense the pressure would be on the photographers and the press, especially in England. They have a tremendous gossip press.
Yeah.
And that no matter, even if they went to an island, there were people who would rent boats or rent helicopters to try to find them. So Yoko came up with the idea that said, well, as long as we can't really hide, why don't we just get out in public, sit in our honeymoon bed,
right,
invite the press in, they'll all come in and take a picture of us, and all we do is put the word peace in the background. And then every single newspaper in the world carries the word peace on the cover. And that's what they did.
Yeah, it was brilliant.
It wasn't just as a joke. In order to get the word peace in front of everybody's mind in the whole world. And it worked.
Yeah, it felt like John was putting a purpose behind it all, behind his fame and stuff.
Well, John and Yoko, I mean, you got to admit that, because he always talked about it. People constantly say John, but it was really John and Yoko.
Yeah.
I think one time John said that John and Yoko was one word.
I just mean the amount of attention and fame that was behind John at the time. Right. It seemed like he was using that as a fuel.
Yeah, they definitely used that. Yoko was a conceptual artist from the beginning. She liked the idea of coming up with a thought, and this thought was the artwork. And John was the one who could get that thought on the front page of the paper. So they were a good team.
Yeah. I was a Beatles fan, but I became more attracted to John because I share his birthday, October 9th, which is coming up real soon here. And because I share the same birthday with him and his son, Sean. Yeah. And so I always felt kind of connected knowing that he was a Libra just like me, and I just felt some kind of connection to what he was doing and what he was saying. I have to ask you this too, though. I know you talked about it a million times, but probably your most famous picture is the New York City T-shirt picture of John. Can you, I know the story, but will you tell it for the people who are listening here again so they can get the idea of what that shooting was like and how that T-shirt got on him and stuff?
Well, the T-shirt was actually made by some guys. It wasn't even in a store. I just saw these guys selling them on a blanket in Times Square, and I liked the graphics of it. It was very simple, but very powerful.
Yeah.
And after I bought the first one, I saw them a few more times around Times Square, and I bought a couple more for myself until I had about 5 or 6. And I bought some for my friends when I'd see them. And one night when I was going to the record plant, and John and Yoko were recording, and I saw the guys in the street, and I bought one and gave it to John. And I cut the sleeves off with a buck knife. Just to give it more of a New York macho feel, and I gave it to him. And then a year later, he'd gone to Los Angeles. He got drunk with a whole bunch of people. I'm alive because I skipped that period. I couldn't afford to actually play and hang out with them. I would have liked to, but I didn't. And anyway, when he came back to New York, he asked me to do a photo session for the album cover, Walls and Bridges. And it was basically a series of photos just straight up of his face. And then the art director trimmed it, and they made some flaps that would flap over the album, so it was more like a toy. You could change the expressions by putting a different eyes or different mouths on the picture.
Right.
And did a whole series of pictures just close up on his face. And then when that was done, John said, well, let's take some more pictures so we have pictures for the publicity kit. And he was wearing a black shirt and jacket, and I took some more pictures around the roof. And then since the skyline of New York was all around us, I said, by the way, do you still have that T-shirt that I gave you last year? And he said he knew where it was, and he went and put it on. So I knew he liked it because he still had it a year later. He got a lot of things that he didn't necessarily hang on to.
Right.
But he had that shirt, he put it on, he looked great. And we took a series of pictures, never expecting that picture was going to be the one that people, liked the most. John was somebody who had hundreds of thousands of pictures taken of him.
Yeah.
But I know he liked it because a month after I took it, he did an interview with Interview Magazine, which was known for having famous people interview famous people, like Liza Minnelli might interview Elizabeth Taylor or something like that. Yeah. John interviewed himself.
Nice.
he used his nickname. His middle name was Winston, so his nickname, his hotel name was Dr. Winston. So he had John Lennon interviewed by Dr. Winston, and it was very funny actually. There was an interview with Ringo, and John took the whole interview and he crossed out Ringo's answers and he wrote his all new answers, but he used the same old questions. You know? And for that interview, he used my New York City picture, it was a full page. So I knew he liked it, and it was maybe printed once or twice more. But then when John passed, there was a short memorial in Central Park. Yoko had asked for people around the world to observe 10 minutes of silence. And the city wanted to have a place where they thought a lot of people were going to come to Dakota and block all the traffic on the west side. So they wanted to divert them into Central Park. And they called and asked me if I could have a picture that they could put in the band shell as something for people to focus on. And I remember looking at it, and there's several different pictures I had of John. Of course, the first one is I had a picture of him with a guitar because he was a Beatle, he was a musician.
Right.
But looking at the picture, I thought, he was much more than that to a lot of people. And there was a picture of him looking very intellectual, like the thinker that had been on the cover of the New York Times. And I thought, well, that's, more of the intellectual thinking side of John. I said, but it was more than that. And the picture of him with the New York City T-shirt, he's very open and very available. He looks like he's about to have a conversation because it was taken in the middle of a conversation.
Yeah.
We were talking and having a good time. And he just looks so available in that picture. And the fact that the T-shirt said New York City was important because when he was shot in New York, a lot of people felt that was because New York was so dangerous.
Yeah.
In fact, when someone called and told me John had been shot, my first thought was maybe he went outside and got mugged, because a lot of people in those days were getting mugged. And Yoko published something on the Thursday of that week, the same day they called me for the picture. Yoko had published a piece in the New York Times kind of asking people, it was a lot of merchandising. A lot of people were trying to cash in, and she was saying, don't try to just make money on this. If you have a good cause, we can do that, but otherwise you should get permission. But one of the things that Yoko said was, don't blame New York for John's murder. That the person who killed John came from Hawaii, and would have come to wherever they lived. So whenever I'm giving a talk about it, I always say that John died in New York because he lived in New York, and he died going home.
Yeah.
And that's why I picked a picture that said New York City on it, because I really felt at that point, and one of the reasons I asked him to wear the shirt is because he was so comfortable in New York.
Yeah.
He really liked living here. He liked the freedom that he had. That in England, there was a whole Beatlemania. But in New York, you could walk outside and take a taxi cab, and somebody would go, "Oh, you're John Lennon," but they would leave him alone and let him take a cab ride somewhere. He could walk around in the street, go to the corner, and get a newspaper, and be a normal person. So I really felt that he was becoming a New Yorker. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I picked that picture. And then I picked it. I picked that picture for the memorial. And what happened there was it was on international news, and it was picked up by TV and press all over the world, focused on the memorial that was in New York. And that started spreading that photo around, and then it just grew. People just liked the picture.
And that shirt had sleeves on originally, but what did you do to it?
It's like I say, when I bought it, the shirt, it was a regular T-shirt with sleeves, but I liked it better without the sleeves. That's the way I wore it. It had more of a New York tough guy look.
Rock and roll.
And so the one that I gave John, I cut the sleeves. I always carried a buck knife back in those days, about a 4-inch brass, very strong hunting knife kind of thing, a working knife. And so I cut the sleeves. It was kind of funny for me when I saw the T-shirt on a mannequin in the John Lennon Museum that they had in Tokyo. And you look at this corner of the sleeves, and there's little hairs sticking out because it wasn't finished the way
but that really
but then
captured the rock and roll vibe.
Yeah, very much. Very much too. It was much more of a rock and roll look.
Okay. And then, man, you've shot so many different artists. I don't want to talk through them all, or we will be here till 9 a.m. tomorrow morning if we talked about everyone. But I know you became really good friends with the New York Dolls, and The Clash were two of the bands that you really connected with and made for good close friends with. You want to tell any stories about that? It's some crazy times.
Well, my book is titled Right Place, Right Time, because that's the way things happen for me. That just one thing always just leads to the other, because I just happen to be there and I meet somebody and it goes on to the next thing. When I met John and Yoko, and I started getting along with them very well, and they were the Elvis Memory Band was the band that they were using as studio musicians, backing them up. And the Elvis were managed by some agents, the Lieber Krebs agency, and I did it. And after they did the Sometime in New York album, they did an Elvis Memory album, and I took a lot of pictures of them. I was taking pictures for their cover of the album, and so I went and met the managers. And when I was in the office, another guy who was in the office, a drummer named Tony Machine, said, "You should come and see this other band that we manage. They're called the New York Dolls, and they're playing at the Mercer Arts Center." And Tony was the guy who ran the door. He said, "Come on down, I'll let you in." And so I went down there a couple of times. I saw the New York Dolls. I was completely blown away. They were the most fun band I've ever seen. And I started hanging out with them. I got to get along with them. David and Serinda became, the whole band, Johnny and Sil, became like family. Right. We would have dinner together. David and I ended up spending almost every day together for the next 5 or 6 years, going to parties and bars all over New York. And then it was, as the Dolls were breaking up in 1975 in the winter, drugs and alcohol was getting to them. They were selling out concerts, but the audience would go so berserk they would wreck the theater. So no theater owners wanted to book them, even if they were going to sell out the place. They were going to wreck the place.
Yeah, right.
So, and the band was having trouble. Johnny and Jerry ended up with heroin habits, and they would be showing up too late. Like the show was supposed to go on at 11. They wouldn't get to the place until after 1 o'clock. So it was really falling apart when Malcolm McLaren showed up. And he had met the band, and he was talking about making clothes for them. And it started out, I think Sylvain wanted a pair of red boots, and then somebody wanted some red pants, and somebody wanted a red jacket. And they all got red outfits. And I think Johnny's was leather and David's was gabardine. So they were all different, but they were all the same bright color red. And Malcolm came to New York with these clothes for the band, and the band was breaking up. The management had dropped them. They were really in a bad situation. And so Malcolm kind of pulled them together. He got Johnny and Jerry into a hospital to save their lives, which I really credit him with saving their lives at that point. And Arthur as well, who was just totally alcoholic. I saw him wake up one morning, take a bottle of vodka and drink a glass the way people drink a glass of water when they wake up. I mean,
right.
Not shot or anything, but literally like 8 ounces just to wake up.
Wow.
So he went in the hospital too, and that saved his life.
Yeah.
And that's all because Malcolm, helped him out because he wanted them to wear his clothes. So he organized a couple of shows, and we referred to them as the Red Shows. And to try to hype it over the top, the Dolls had caused a lot of commotion and shock by wearing makeup and frilly clothes. People thought they were homosexual, and that was outrageous, that they were so public about it. And there was nothing homosexual about them, actually. They were the most macho gang of guys I've ever met. Yeah. But they did wear whatever they felt like wearing. They wore makeup, and they dressed like dolls because girls like to play with dolls. They weren't dressing up to attract men. They were dressing up to attract women. But that's besides the point. Anyway, Malcolm got them back on a stage and put them back together. And that's how I met Malcolm, was when he was here helping out the Dolls. And at the end of the Dolls, he tried to do a tour similar to what happened with the Sex Pistols. Malcolm had the idea that instead of playing in New York, he liked outrage and chaos. And the whole idea of the Red Show, he had Serinda actually sewed the flag. He made a big red flag that was like a Chinese communist flag, and put that up behind the band. And he put out a press release, but instead of calling it a press release, he called it a manifesto. And said that the paper tiger government of Lieber Krebs was no more, and now the new dolls were coming out. And he made the whole thing sound communist because he thought that in America, the one thing they hated even more than homosexuals was communists.
They sure do, yes.
And he thought, well, if they've got that when they thought they were homosexuals, what happens if they think they're communists? So he thought that would be even more scandalous and outrageous. However, nobody thought that these gay-looking guys were communists. They really didn't care if they were waving around Mao's little red book.
Right.
It's actually a very bad taste, but fortunately that period didn't last too long.
No.
But anyway, he tried to get them to play across the South. in places where punk rock or rock and roll in general had not been played before, to really rile up the rednecks, and show them these New York doll, gay communists. But unfortunately, Johnny and Jerry's drug habits were a little harder to break than he realized. And after just a couple of days in Florida, where they were going to start their tour, Johnny and Jerry had to come back to New York to score and continue their habit. And David had told them that if they didn't, that if drugs were more important than the band, then the band was over. And so when they left, David, said the band is over.
Yeah.
And Malcolm and Syl decided to go to New Orleans and see if they could find some musicians to start a new band. And so they drove from Florida over to New Orleans. They did buy a lot of records, but they didn't really find any musicians. And Malcolm had the idea to go back to England and put a band together, and Sylvain was going to come over and join them. And in fact, when Malcolm went back a month or so later, he brought Sylvain's big white guitar and his electric piano. And then Malcolm did start a band. He got Steve Jones and Paul Cook and Glenn Matlock, and Syl was supposed to come over. I had a little role in this because Syl and David were broke after the band broke up, and a friend of mine in Japan wanted to book them to play a festival and paying them about $10,000 a piece. So they took the job in Japan, and Malcolm got tired of waiting for Sylvain, and he got this other guy, Johnny Rotten, to be the leader of his new band. And that's how that all happened.
Sex Pistols.
Just while I'm on it, there's another little aside about that, is that when Malcolm was looking for a singer instead of Syl, he talked to Vivian about it. And Vivian said, well, there's this guy named John who hangs out in the store all the time, and he's really weird, and he'd probably be a good, front man. So Malcolm went down to the store, and there was Johnny Rotten and, a few other kids, whatever. And he liked Johnny. And there's a famous story about how he auditioned and singing an Alice Cooper song in front of the jukebox. And he said, okay, you're great. And started working with him. And a couple of weeks later, Vivian said, how's it going? And Malcolm said, oh, that kid, John, that you said, he's really good. You come and see him. He's doing a really good job. And Vivian came to rehearsal and said, I didn't mean that one. I meant the other John Ritchie, who, picked up the name Sid Vicious later on.
Right. And how much time did you spend around that band? I know you have some famous shots with them.
I went to England I remember the first time, it was like maybe 6-8 months later, there was a mention in the NME. I used to get the English newspapers because I had my pictures in them.
Right.
And John was in my house reading the paper, and I remember reading it. He said, oh, here's the story about the Sex Pistols. I said, Sex Pistols? What's that? He goes, oh, that's Malcolm's new band. And I said, Sex Pistols? You can't call a band Sex Pistols. Nobody's going to say that on the radio. Nobody's going to play that record. You can't say the word Sex Pistol in public. And I was wrong. I mean, nowadays you say it, it rolls over your tongue. It sounds like a band.
Yeah.
But remember, my first impression was like, you can't say that, in public. And when I went to England, Malcolm introduced me. He took me to a place called Club Louise. And I met in that one club. I met the Clash, the Sex Pistols, Susie and the Banshees, Billy Idol.
Wow.
I think Elvis Costello was there. I know John Savage and Caroline Coon, who were the journalists who wrote about the upcoming punk scene. It was like the whole English punk scene, being in the CBGBs in the early days. They were all in this one used to be gay club, which was letting weirdos in. So they let these kind of weird punk kids in with spiky hair and weird makeup. And so when I went to England, I met all of them in the first night there. Malcolm took me to this place.
What year was that?
76, November. And then, so I just kind of met people. Malcolm knew everybody, and he had encouraged them to let me take pictures, and he kind of encouraged me because I wasn't used to just taking pictures in a club of people I didn't know who weren't really, some Marco Peroni, I remember saying, oh, I wish I could be in a band. And I said, well, look around you. The competition doesn't do that great, And I came back a year later, he was in the band with Susie and the Banshees or Billy Idol, whichever one. He went on to become a great producer.
It was a real scene going on there with that sound. Yeah. It was just like a whole, again, like the electric rock and roll coming off of folk, like this whole punk music was coming off of what had been rock and roll music before it. and even like the heady music that had come before it. Now there was kind of an
it was
angst
a
energy.
reaction of getting back to rock and roll from bands like ELO and Yes and even Led Zeppelin. You know, these bands
The
that
art
played
rock. Yeah.
massive stadiums that had long, drawn out solos, and people wanted hard driving. Bands that were saying something, but said it quick and loud and fast and rocking, and you could dance to it.
They were angry about stuff, and they wanted to yell it in a microphone, and they wanted to be heard. Yeah.
Right.
Which is like the Clash as well.
Well, Phil Oakes did that, but these people did it a lot louder and a lot faster.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my first love of music was as a drummer, and so I was playing to a lot of the headier music that was out there, whether it was Yes and Genesis and that Pink Floyd's and stuff. But yeah, it wasn't the same energy of the Rolling Stones. And it had gotten really to where you could listen to a record for 12 to 20 minutes for one song, and so this other generation just had something to say about that, and they just, had an energy that was more of in your face. I'm going to punch you in the face with this, and it's all energy. It's all sound. When we started out, that's where we were at too. It was like play it faster, play it louder kind of thing.
Right.
And you were kind of in the midst of it all there, right? I mean, you were just going to, there must have been so many opportunity for so many photos because so much energy was going on around you.
Like I say, right place, right time,
Exactly.
It's just one thing led to another. And I would meet people and I'd work with them and they'd introduce me to the next person. I mean, I think it's kind of funny that meeting John and Yoko led me to the New York Dolls, which led me to the Sex Pistols, which led me to get on their bus and go across America.
Yeah.
And meeting the Sex Pistols actually was how I met the Clash, by being in England and meeting Caroline. And it was Caroline and Vivian Westwood actually that took me to see the Clash for the first time in that 1976 trip. And it was a year later in 77, I came back to England and I got there about a week after the Sex Pistols had been on the Bill Grundy TV show and they had said a curse word and the whole country went crazy because it must have been a slow news day, but they said a common word, and all of a sudden there was headlines across the country saying the filth and the fury. Yeah. And that kind of expression really stuck, although punk rock was not about filth. It was about fury, but not about filth. They say that the Sex Pistols made people want to scream with rage, but the Clash gave people the reasons.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of other bands that were much more intellectual and much deeper than just raging about the past, being angry about the past. The Clash were hopeful and looking towards a better future.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of that music had positivity behind it. It just didn't come across that way on the surface, but it was all about trying to make a change.
The reason I thought of Phil Oakes is because Phil said, I got something to say now and I'm going to say it loud.
Yeah.
And that's what the punks did. They had something to say and they wanted to say it loud.
And then, that just continued on. I read, the list, like I said to everybody, of who you've shot has just went on forever. I mean, from the Led Zeppelins, the Kisses and the Blondies, Ramones, up to Green Day, who you're also good friends with and still shooting today with the music that's out there. And it's all, have you noticed kind of a similar thing about all of that music and the people in it and stuff like we were talking about at the beginning here, and that they have that same kind of energy, even if the music doesn't always come across the same. It's that same creative thing they're trying to communicate through some means of some sound.
Yes, and most of the bands I worked with had a commitment to do better, for the world to do better, for people to be inspired to do better.
Yeah.
Or just to do good, and that's the kind of bands I've always been attracted to. There's another band called the Stripes, which I had great hopes for, because I met them about 8 years ago or so. They were 16 years old, and they had the spirit of rock and roll. They were like seeing the Animals or Eric Burden or some of those early bands playing really good blues music, and just having a feeling of having fun with music and saying something, singing songs that had meaning. But then after about 4 years, when they were 20, they finally broke up because they had been together since they were 6 years old. They were the only
all
kids
time.
in their town. They came from a small town in Ireland, and they were the only kids who were musicians, and they ended up playing together. And after 10 years, by the time they were 16, they were really good at it. But after about 4 years of traveling around the world, it was kind of too much too soon, and they ended up breaking up. But yeah, Green Day was a band that really appealed to me because they said something.
Yeah.
All the songs have meaning. They talk about, I want to be in the minority. I don't like the moral majority.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things was when he was on TV, and Walmart sells more than half of the records. Now people just download everything. But when people were buying records, Walmart was a store that sold more than half the records in the country were sold by the Walmarts in malls around America.
Mm-hmm.
And they had strict rules that you couldn't use curse words on a record. And a lot of bands made a G-rated record for Walmart. There was the explicit album that had the real words that they used, and then there was the cleaner G-rated version.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't lose half their sales in Walmart. Well, Green Day refused to make a G-rated version. They said, this is the way we write the songs. This is the way our fans speak in a normal day. And we speak like them, and we're going to use these words. And the guy said, well, aren't you afraid that Walmart's not going to sell them? And they said, well, if Walmart thinks that our songs are dangerous, then why don't they move them over to the guns and knife department instead of selling them in the record department?
There you go. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's a lot more dangerous things than a few words.
Yeah, and certainly, like I was saying, the message, the energy behind that music, you can't separate it from, you can't pick out one word on a record and separate it from what's behind it all. And that's what they try to do, but you can't. It just doesn't work that way in what we're doing, whether it's any creative element that you're doing. We talked for a long time here. I want to ask you a few questions that I ask all people I talk to just to get some general responses from it. And I think you're someone who's followed his intuition his whole life. And it's kind of, it's something I tell people to do on a regular basis because I think that voice inside you of intuition really leads you in the right direction. But so I'm going to ask you a few generic questions here and just give me some answers to it. What's the worst idea you ever had, but that looked great on paper? You thought this was going to be a great idea, but then it just turned out to be a terrible
one. It didn't work.
If you have one.
No, there's a few of them. Don Letts said that a good idea attempted is better than a bad idea completed.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with that 100%.
I don't know. I don't really remember things that didn't work. I mostly remember things that do work.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's a good perspective.
Offhand, I can't think of. Offhand, nothing really comes to mind.
That's great. That's brilliant. This other one, what's the best ideas you have in life? Would you consider them something that made you a financial gain or something that just gave you a gain in your life, of experience in learning something?
I go for the experience in learning. Those are the experiences. Those are the events that you remember most. Certainly, I remember a couple of things where I made more money than something else, but money comes and goes. Experiences can last forever. So certainly something that had more meaning, something where I learned something or helped somebody has more meaning to me than one time where I made a lot of money.
Yeah.
Although certainly a lot of what I did was done because I had to pay my rent.
Yeah.
A lot of the pictures that are things that I did on my own, like going to CBGBs. Nobody was paying me to go to CBGBs and take pictures of unknown bands. So I would go to, I'd get a job taking pictures of Led Zeppelin. But afterwards, they were done by 11:30. I'd go down to CBGBs and spend another 3 hours there on my own, not making money.
Yeah.
But for me, things like that, I was investing. A lot of times I would invest in my future. That, for instance, if I took pictures, a publicist would hire me to take pictures of a band at a party. I'd always make sure to get a picture of the publicist with the band. And then I would give that picture to the publicist. And very often they said, oh, what do I owe you for this? And rather than saying, well, it cost me $5, I didn't want to be petty like that. And I said, no, you don't owe me anything.
Yeah.
Well, of course, then they did owe me something. And they'd put that picture on the wall and they'd remember that they owed me something. And the next time a job came up, they'd hire me for the job. So instead of getting $5, I get $100.
Yeah. It's tough,
So
though.
I was always investing in myself in the future.
It's tough, though, the balance. I find I've spent 35 years or whatever in music industry, and I talk to young people about that sometime, the difference of doing music or art or whatever for art's sake compared to having to make a living at it. You do have to make some choices because you do have bills to pay or you have kids to take care of and stuff like that. And it's always kind of a balancing act between surviving till tomorrow and doing what you have to do to be in the industry of making music or something or art compared to doing it for art's sake. You want to talk at all about like that?
My motto is, a guy named Stan Freberg was an advertising guy in the 50s, and I got my motto from him, and it's Ars Gratiae Pecuniae, which is mispronounced Latin for art for the sake of money. I always wanted to make art, but I always wanted to be paid for it.
You want to survive, yeah. You want to survive to be able to keep doing it again tomorrow. I think that was my goal in it, too. It's like you have to make some choices in order to survive to be able to do it again tomorrow or next year or something like that. Well, I want to thank you so much for being here, taking time out and talk to me. It's been a real honor for me to talk to you. You have amazing experiences, and you were Mr. Right Place, Right Time. That's your new book, the memoirs, The Life of a Rock and Roll Photographer. You are the man. I mean, you have been there.
Your local book dealer.
Yeah, run out and get it. The stories are incredible, and he's worked with everybody out there from
and
50s
my other
to
book,
now.
my big tome here is the this one, Rock Scene.
Yeah. Look at that. Beautiful pictures.
That scene, this is the monograph, over 500 pictures in this one book.
Yes.
So
get those. And I thank you so much.
But the biography is a companion piece, because the other books I have are all photographs. There's a John Lennon New York Years book, a New York Dolls book. There's a Green Day book that came out last year.
Yeah.
But autobiography is the one that explains all the stories and how I got there and what I did to get my pictures.
Well, it's brilliant. And I thank you once again for being with us today. Have a beautiful day.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. So this is Kurt Newman, the Staring at the World podcast. I thank you for listening to part 2 of that amazing interview with Bob Gruen. I would ask you humbly to subscribe and join us as much as you can. I'm trying to interview really interesting people with interesting stories, talk about the creative element. It's at the core of everything we do. And once again, I appreciate your time, and I appreciate you listeners, and for many, many years, the support you've given me. So thank you very much. Another virtual hug for y'all. You guys take care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for listening to Staring at the World with BoDeans, Kurt Newman, a podcast about creative innovation. Please be sure to download, subscribe, rate, and review, and keep listening wherever you get your podcasts.